The moment Kshama Sawant let out that condescending chuckle on the congressional hearing room floor, she had no idea that Jonathan Roumie was about to deliver a line that would silence her forever. What happened in the next 30 seconds didn't just shock everyone in the room, it completely flipped the script on one of the most powerful progressive voices in America. The 49-year-old Seattle councilwoman thought she could dismiss the young actor with a laugh and a wave of her hand. After all, she'd been fighting for progressive causes for years, and her experience was well known. But Roumie, armed with facts he never saw coming, was about to prove that experience doesn't always beat preparation. This wasn't just another congressional hearing. This was the moment a rising star took down a political legend, and the entire progressive movement watched in stunned silence as their hero got schooled by someone they hadn't expected. Before we dive into this incredible showdown, make sure to hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. You won't want to miss what happens next because this story is about to get wild. The committee room was packed that Tuesday morning, cameras rolling as the heated budget hearing continued into its third hour. Sawant sat at the curved wooden table, her signature, determined expression in place, with her deep Seattle accent filling the room as she passionately defended her position on healthcare spending. Across from her, Jonathan Roumie sat quietly, his navy blazer sharp against his well-defined features, his hair neatly styled to frame his serious, focused face. At 49, he was relatively new to politics, and Sawant clearly didn't see him as a threat. That was her first mistake. The tension had been building all morning. Sawant had been pushing her social justice agenda with her usual fiery approach, dismissing any opposition with sharp retorts in that familiar, commanding style that had made her famous. When other committee members tried to challenge her numbers, she'd wave them off with decades of experience in righteous indignation. But Roumie had been taking notes, lots of notes. As Sawant wrapped up another passionate speech about the flaws in the current healthcare system, she leaned back in her chair with a satisfied smirk. The room was hers, and she knew it. Committee members nodded along, some taking notes, others checking their phones. It was vintage Sawant, passionate, commanding, and completely in control. Then Roumie raised his hand. "Councilwoman Sawant," he said, his voice cutting through the room with quiet authority, "I'd like to address some of the figures you just presented." Sawant looked up, her expression shifting from satisfaction to mild amusement. She glanced around the room, making eye contact with a few other committee members as if to say, "Here we go again, another rookie trying to challenge the master." "Of course, Mr. Roumie," she said, her tone dripping with the kind of condescending politeness that veteran politicians reserve for newcomers they don't take seriously. "Please enlighten us with your perspective." And then it happened. Sawant let out a small chuckle, not loud enough to be disrespectful, but clear enough for everyone in the room to hear. It was the kind of laugh that said, "This should be entertaining," mixed with, "I've got time to humor the kid." The sound echoed off the marble walls of the hearing room, and in that moment something shifted in Roumie's eyes. The quiet determination was still there, but now it was backed by something else. A fire that Sawant was about to discover she'd lit herself. He opened his leather portfolio, pulled out a stack of papers, and looked directly at Sawant. His next words would change everything. To understand what happened next, you need to know who these two political powerhouses really are, and why this moment mattered so much more than just another congressional disagreement. Kshama Sawant, the 49-year-old Seattle councilwoman, had been fighting for the same causes for years. She was the voice of progressive politics in her city, known for her socialist policies and passionate arguments for the working class. She was the councilwoman who made waves, calling for corporate tax increases, championing healthcare reform, and standing against the establishment. But here's what people forget about Sawant. She's also incredibly stubborn, set in her ways, and not used to being challenged by people she considers less experienced. She's been giving the same speeches about wealth inequality and healthcare for so long that she sometimes acts like she owns the progressive playbook. And in rooms like this one, surrounded by younger politicians, she often treats them like students rather than equals. On the other side of the committee table sat Jonathan Roumie, and if Sawant had done her homework, she would have known she was about to mess with the wrong person. At 49, Roumie had already built a reputation as someone deeply involved in social justice causes. While known for his career as an actor, Roumie had taken a particular interest in policies that affected people at the grassroots level, especially healthcare reform. Unlike some politicians who rely on staff to do their research, Roumie was known for diving deep into policy details himself. He had seen how healthcare had personally affected his family, And healthcare wasn't just a political issue for him. It was personal. But unlike Sawant, who approached the issue with passion and big speeches, Roumie believed in practical solutions backed by hard data. Her colleagues had learned not to underestimate him the hard way. In his early involvement in politics, Roumie had taken down an experienced politician during a heated discussion about racial equality, using his own prior statements to expose contradictions. The video went viral, and suddenly everyone knew that the quiet political newcomer from California came prepared for battle. But Kshama Sawant didn't know any of this. To her, Jonathan Roumie was just another young political newcomer who had probably gotten lucky in a safe district. She was about to learn otherwise. The stakes of this confrontation went far beyond just these two people. The progressive movement was at a crossroads. For years, Sawant had been its undisputed leader, but a new generation of progressive politicians was rising, younger, more diverse, and sometimes more pragmatic than the Seattle councilwoman. This wasn't just about healthcare policy. This was about the future of progressive politics. Would it continue to be dominated by Sawant's style of passionate rhetoric and broad proposals? Or would it evolve toward the more detail-oriented, practical approach that politicians like Roumie represented? The room was full of political reporters, lobbyists, and staffers who understood exactly what they were witnessing. This wasn't just another policy disagreement. This was a potential changing of the guard playing out in real time on live television. Sawant sat there with her confident smirk, completely unaware that she was about to become a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating your opponents. She'd built her career on fighting for the little guy, but she was about to learn that sometimes the little guy fights back. Roumie, meanwhile, had been waiting for this moment for months. He'd watched Sawant dominate hearing after hearing with her passionate speeches and dismissive attitude toward anyone who dared question her approach. He'd seen her wave off legitimate concerns with the kind of arrogance that comes from decades of being treated like a progressive prophet. Today, that was going to end. As Roumie organized his papers and prepared to speak, he knew that what he said next would either establish him as a serious player in progressive politics or mark him as just another politician who tried to take on Sawant and failed. The difference was, he actually had the ammunition to back up his challenge. Sawant leaned forward in her chair, that familiar combative gleam in her eyes as she prepared to do what she'd done to countless other politicians over the years: dismantle their arguments with righteous fury and decades of experience. "Mr. Roumie," she began, her voice carrying the confident authority that had intimidated senators and presidents alike. "I've been fighting for healthcare reform for longer than you've been politically active. I've studied the systems that work, like the one in Canada. We've seen it work. We know what's needed." She paused dramatically, letting her words sink in while adjusting her glasses, a gesture that had become as much a part of her brand as her passionate speeches. "Now, I'm sure you have some concerns, and that's fine. But let me tell you something about the current system," she continued. And off she went into her standard speech about the flaws in the current healthcare system, insurance company profits, and administrative costs. Speaking with the confidence of someone who'd given this exact presentation thousands of times, the other committee members started to tune out. They'd heard this before. Some checked their phones, others shuffled papers. This was just Sawant being Sawant, passionate, repetitive, and completely convinced of her own righteousness. But Roumie wasn't tuning out. He was taking more notes, and anyone watching closely would have noticed the slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Sawant was giving him exactly what he needed. "Councilwoman," he interjected politely when she paused for breath, "I appreciate your passion and certainly respect your experience." Sawant nodded approvingly, clearly expecting praise or at least respectful deference to her progressive credentials. But Roumie continued, and that one word made Sawant's expression shift slightly. "I think we need to look at some specific numbers that might complicate your projections." Sawant waved her hand dismissively. "Numbers, numbers, numbers. Mr. Roumie, with all due respect, I've been looking at these numbers longer than you've been involved in politics. The American people don't need more complicated analysis. They need healthcare as a human right." There was that condescending tone again, and this time it was picked up by the microphones for everyone watching to hear. Several committee members looked up from their phones, sensing that something was shifting in the room's dynamic. "I understand that perspective, Councilwoman," Roumie replied, his voice remaining steady and professional. "But the American people also need accurate information about how we're going to pay for these programs and how they'll actually work in practice." Sawant let out a longer laugh this time, one that echoed through the hearing room. She looked around at her colleagues with an expression that clearly said, "Can you believe this kid is trying to lecture me on healthcare policy?" "Mr. Roumie, please," she said, still chuckling. "I think you might be overthinking this. Medicare for all is simple. We expand Medicare to cover everyone. The savings from eliminating insurance company profits alone will fund most of the program. These aren't new concepts." That's when Roumie opened his portfolio and pulled out a thick stack of documents. The papers were organized with colored tabs, charts, and what appeared to be extensive research. Sawant's smile faltered slightly as she realized this wasn't going to be as easy as she'd expected. "Councilwoman Sawant," Roumie said, his voice gaining strength, "I've spent the last 6 months reviewing the Congressional Budget Office analysis of your Medicare for All proposal, and I've found some significant discrepancies between your public statements and the actual projected costs." The room went quiet. This wasn't the usual passionate back and forth about philosophical approaches to healthcare. This was about to get technical, and everyone could sense it. Sawant's expression hardened. She wasn't used to being challenged on specifics, especially not by someone she clearly considered a political newcomer. Her usual approach was to overwhelm opponents with passion and moral authority, not get bogged down in detailed policy analysis. "Mr. Roumie," she said, her voice taking on an edge, "I don't need some rookie politician telling me what the budget office says. I've been working with budget analysts since you were in elementary school." The dismissive comment hung in the air like a slap. Several committee members visibly cringed at Sawant's tone, and Roumie's professional demeanor cracked for just a moment, revealing a flash of the steel beneath. But instead of getting angry, he smiled. It was the kind of smile that should have warned Kshama Sawant she was walking into a trap, but her arrogance was too thick for her to notice. "I'm sure you have, Councilwoman," Roumie replied calmly, "which is why I'm so surprised by some of the statements you made just 20 minutes ago." He flipped to a specific page in his notes, and Sawant could see that it was covered in highlighted text and detailed annotations. "You stated that Medicare for All would save the average American family $3,000 per year compared to current insurance costs. You also said that the program would cost approximately $32 trillion over 10 years, which you claimed would be fully offset by eliminating insurance company overhead and negotiating prescription drug prices." Sawant nodded impatiently. "That's right. Those are the facts." "Are they?" Roumie asked quietly. The question hung in the air, and for the first time since the hearing began, Sawant looked uncertain. She wasn't used to having her facts questioned by someone who clearly had done extensive research. "What are you suggesting, Mr. Roumie?" she asked, her voice losing some of its confident bluster. Roumie pulled out another document, this one with official government letterhead. "Well, Councilwoman, according to the Congressional Budget Office's most recent analysis, which was completed just last month and apparently hasn't made it into your talking points yet, the actual cost would be closer to $38 trillion over 10 years. Sawant shifted in her chair, her confident posture beginning to crack. That's within the margin of error." $6 trillion within the margin of error?" Roumie asked, raising an eyebrow while flipping through his meticulously organized notes. "Councilwoman, that's more than the entire current annual federal budget. That's not a rounding error. That's the difference between a realistic proposal and a fantasy." He paused, letting his words sink in while Sawant struggled to find a response. The other committee members were now leaning forward in their chairs, sensing that this exchange was about to become something much more significant than a routine policy discussion. "But let's put that in terms regular families can understand," Roumie continued, his voice gaining momentum. $6 trillion over 10 years means that every working family in America would pay approximately $1,800 more in taxes than you've been telling them. That's rent money for millions of families. That's college savings. That's the difference between financial security and financial stress for working people you claim to represent. The other committee members were now paying full attention. Some were frantically taking notes. Others were trying to look up the budget office report on their phones. The casual atmosphere of a routine hearing had evaporated, replaced by the tension of a real political confrontation. Sawant was starting to look flustered, but she wasn't ready to back down. "Mr. Roumie, you're cherry-picking numbers to attack a program that would help millions of Americans. This is exactly the kind of petty political game playing that keeps us from making real progress." It was a classic Sawant move. When challenged on specifics, pivot to moral authority and accuse the challenger of playing politics. It had worked for her countless times before, but Roumie wasn't backing down. "Councilwoman," he said, his voice growing stronger, "I'm not playing games. I'm trying to figure out how we're going to explain to American families why their taxes are going to be $2,000 higher per year than you promised them. Sawant's face was starting to redden. Those numbers are preliminary, Roumie interrupted, pulling out yet another document. Because according to your own office's analysis, which I obtained through a Freedom of Information request, your staff has known about these revised cost projections for 3 months. The room went dead silent. This wasn't just about policy disagreements anymore. Roumie was essentially accusing Sawant of knowingly misleading the public about the costs of her signature proposal. Sawant stared at him, her mouth slightly open. For the first time in decades, the woman who'd built her career on having all the answers found herself speechless. But Roumie wasn't done. He had one more bombshell to drop. And Sawant was about to discover that her dismissive laughter had awakened something she really didn't want to deal with. The moment Kshama Sawant realized she was in serious trouble came when Jonathan Roumie pulled out a folder marked with her own council office letterhead. Her eyes widened as she recognized the document, and for the first time in the entire hearing, her confident demeanor cracked completely. "Councilwoman Sawant," Roumie said, his voice now carrying the authority of someone who knew he held all the cards. "Since you seem to think I'm just making up numbers to attack your program, let me read you something directly from your own staff's internal analysis." He opened the folder and pulled out several pages of official council correspondence. Sawant's face went pale as she recognized the documents. Internal communications that were supposed to be confidential, but had apparently been released through proper legal channels. "This is from a memo dated 3 months ago," Roumie continued, his voice steady but growing in intensity. "Written by your own chief policy advisor to your communications director," he said, and I quote, "The councilwoman needs to stop citing the $32 trillion figure in public appearances. Our updated analysis shows costs will exceed $38 trillion, and the tax burden on middle-class families will be significantly higher than we've been claiming." The hearing room erupted. Committee members started talking over each other. Reporters frantically scribbled notes, and cameras zoomed in on Sawant's increasingly uncomfortable expression. But Roumie wasn't finished reading. The memo continued. "We're particularly concerned about the councilwoman's claims regarding family savings. Our analysis shows that families earning between $50,000 and $100,000 annually would actually pay more under Medicare for all than they currently pay for private insurance when you factor in the required payroll taxes." Sawant tried to interrupt. "Mr. Roumie, internal staff discussions are taken out of context." "Out of context?" Roumie's voice rose for the first time, and the controlled fury in his tone silenced not just Sawant, but the entire room. "Councilwoman, this isn't some casual staff discussion. This is a detailed analysis that directly contradicts every public statement you've made about your own proposal for the past year." He stood up from his chair, holding the documents in his hand, like a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. "Do you want to know what really bothers me about this, Councilwoman Sawant?" he asked, his voice carrying a moral authority that rivaled hers. "It's not that the numbers were wrong. Policy is complicated. Projections change. I understand that." Sawant started to nod, perhaps thinking he was about to give her an out. "What bothers me," Roumie continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, "is that when I asked legitimate questions about these costs, you laughed at me. You dismissed me like I was some naive kid who didn't understand the issues. You've been doing it to other members of this committee for months." The room was completely silent now. Every person present could feel the shift in power happening in real time. "But here's the thing, Councilwoman," Roumie continued. "I did understand the issues. I did my homework. I spent months reviewing every line of budget analysis, every cost projection, every economic impact study. And what I found was that either you didn't know what your own staff was telling you, or you knew and you decided to keep misleading the American people." Sawant's face was now completely red, and her hands were visibly shaking. The woman who had spent decades as the moral voice of progressive politics was being systematically dismantled by someone half her age using her own documents. "Now," Roumie said, sitting back down but maintaining his commanding presence, "you have a choice. You can keep laughing at me and dismissing my concerns, or you can explain to this committee and to the American people why you've been knowingly presenting inaccurate information about a program that would fundamentally reshape our entire healthcare system." Sawant opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. For perhaps the first time in her political career, Kshama Sawant had been completely outmaneuvered. But Roumie still wasn't done. He had saved his biggest revelation for last. "Councilwoman Yin," he said, pulling out one final document. "There's one more thing. This memo is from your staff to several major progressive donors, explaining that you were aware of the cost discrepancies, but felt that revealing them publicly would undermine progressive momentum and provide ammunition to Republican opponents." The bombshell hit like a nuclear weapon. Sawant wasn't just guilty of having inaccurate numbers. She was guilty of deliberately concealing accurate information from the public for political reasons. "So let me ask you directly, Councilwoman Sawant," Roumie said, his voice now carrying the full weight of moral authority. "How is deliberately misleading American families about the true cost of healthcare reform any different from what you've accused insurance companies of doing for decades?" The comparison was devastating. Sawant had built her entire career on attacking corporate dishonesty and advocating for transparency. Now she was being accused of the same kind of deceptive practices she'd spent her life fighting against. Sawant tried one last time to regain control. "Mr. Roumie, you're twisting internal discussions." "Am I?" Roumie interrupted, holding up another page. "Because this email from your communications director specifically instructs staff to avoid detailed cost discussions and to redirect to moral arguments about healthcare as a right whenever pressed on specifics." He looked directly at Sawant, his eyes blazing with the righteous indignation she'd once monopolized. "Councilwoman, I believe healthcare is a human right. I believe we need to fix our broken system, but I also believe that American families deserve honest information about what that's going to cost them and how it's going to work. And if you can't provide that honesty, then maybe it's time for someone else to lead this fight." The words hung in the air like a challenge, the old guard versus the new, experience versus preparation, passion versus precision. Sawant sat there, her signature fire completely extinguished, looking every bit of her 49 years. The woman who had inspired millions with her calls for political revolution had just been revolutionized herself. Committee members sat in stunned silence, many of them realizing they had just witnessed a changing of the guard in progressive politics. The era of Kshama Sawant's unquestioned leadership was ending, and Jonathan Roumie had just announced himself as a major player in whatever came next. But the most telling moment came when Sawant finally tried to respond. Her voice, usually so strong and commanding, came out as barely more than a whisper. "Mr. Roumie," she said, her earlier arrogance completely gone. I think there may have been some miscommunication between my staff and..." She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. For the first time anyone could remember, Kshama Sawant had been rendered speechless by an opponent who had simply come better prepared than she was. The progressive movement had a new voice, and Roumie had just announced himself in the most dramatic way possible by taking down the movement's longtime leader with nothing more than facts, preparation, and the courage to speak truth to power. The hearing room remained frozen in stunned silence for what felt like an eternity after Jonathan Roumie delivered his final blow. Committee members sat motionless. Reporters had stopped taking notes mid-sentence, and even the usually busy staffers had ceased their constant shuffling of papers. Sawant stared down at the table in front of her, her hands clasped together to stop their trembling. The woman who had controlled the narrative of progressive politics for over a decade had just been systematically dismantled by someone she'd dismissed as a rookie. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. The champion of fighting for the little guy had just been taken down by someone she'd treated as little. The committee chair, clearly sensing the historic nature of what had just occurred, carefully cleared his throat and attempted to restore some semblance of normal proceedings. "Councilwoman Sawant," he said gently, "would you like to respond to Mr. Roumie's presentation?" Sawant looked up slowly, and for a moment it seemed like she might try to mount some kind of counterattack. Her mouth opened slightly, and the familiar fire flickered briefly in her eyes. But then she glanced at the stack of documents in front of Roumie. Her own documents, her own staff's analysis, her own words being used against her. And the fight went out of her completely. "I think," she said quietly, her voice barely carrying across the room, "we should probably take a recess and reconvene tomorrow to discuss these documents in more detail." "We should probably take a recess and reconvene tomorrow to discuss these documents in more detail." It was a complete surrender. Kshama Sawant, who had never backed down from a fight in her life, was essentially asking for a time out like an overwhelmed child. The committee chair quickly agreed, and as the hearing was brought to a close, the real drama began. Within minutes, the video clips were everywhere. Political reporters who had attended the hearing, thinking it would be routine budget discussions, found themselves with the story of the year. The footage of Sawant's dismissive laughter, followed by Roumie's systematic takedowns, spread across social media like wildfire. The hashtag Roumie destroys Sawant started trending within an hour, accompanied by countless memes and reaction videos. Progressive activists who had long considered Sawant untouchable were forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that their hero had been caught in what appeared to be deliberate deception. Conservative commentators, meanwhile, were having a field day. Here was proof, they argued, that even the most supposedly principled, progressive politicians were just as willing to mislead the public as anyone else. Sawant's hypocrisy became a talking point on every political show in America. But perhaps the most significant reaction came from within the progressive movement itself. Younger activists, many of whom had grown frustrated with Sawant's unwillingness to evolve her positions or listen to new ideas, saw Roumie's performance as a long overdue wake-up call. "This is what accountability looks like," wrote one prominent progressive blogger. "Sawant built her career on demanding honesty from others. It's about time someone demanded it from her." Others were more critical of Roumie, arguing that he had damaged progressive unity by attacking Sawant so publicly. "We should be fighting Republicans, not each other," complained one longtime Sawant supporter on social media. But the damage to Sawant's reputation was already done. For the first time in her career, her authenticity, her greatest political asset, was being seriously questioned. The fallout continued over the following days as more details emerged about Sawant's office's handling of the Medicare for all cost projections. Additional leaked emails showed a pattern of staff concerns about the accuracy of Sawant's public statements and her reluctance to address those concerns directly. Progressive donors began privately expressing concerns about Sawant's leadership. Several major advocacy groups quietly distanced themselves from her Medicare for all proposal, calling instead for more comprehensive analysis before moving forward. Meanwhile, Roumie found himself thrust into the national spotlight in a way he'd never experienced. His office was flooded with interview requests from major news networks, speaking invitations from political organizations, and messages of support from progressive activists across the country. "Congressman Roumie did what needed to be done," said one prominent healthcare policy expert. "Progressive politics can't be based on good intentions alone. We need leaders who are willing to deal with reality, even when it's complicated." But Roumie himself seemed determined not to let the moment go to his head. In his first interview after the hearing, he was careful to emphasize that his goal wasn't to destroy Sawant personally, but to ensure that progressive policies were based on accurate information. "I have tremendous respect for Councilwoman Sawant and everything she's accomplished," he said. "But respect can't mean blind acceptance of inaccurate information. If we're going to fight for healthcare reform, we need to do it with honest numbers and realistic expectations." The contrast with Sawant's own response was stark. The Seattle councilwoman largely avoided media appearances in the days following the hearing, and when she did speak publicly, she seemed defensive and unfocused. The woman who had once commanded attention with her passionate speeches now seemed uncertain and off balance. The political implications of the confrontation extended far beyond healthcare policy. Democratic Party leaders found themselves in the awkward position of managing what amounted to a public civil war within the progressive wing of their coalition. Some party veterans quietly expressed relief that Sawant's dominance was being challenged. "Bernie's been basically immune from criticism for years," one Democratic strategist confided privately. "Having someone willing to hold him accountable might actually strengthen the progressive movement in the long run." Others worried about the broader impact on Democratic unity heading into the next election cycle. Sawant still commanded significant loyalty among certain segments of the progressive base, and alienating her supporters could have serious electoral consequences. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact was on the future of progressive politics itself. Roumie had emerged as a serious and credible voice for the next generation of progressives. The narrative was shifting from the passionate rhetoric of the old guard to the practical, evidence-based politics of the new. Roumie's systematic dismantling of Sawant's arguments represented a new approach to progressive advocacy, one based on detailed policy analysis rather than just moral passion. "What we're seeing is the emergence of a new generation of progressive leaders," explained one political scientist. "They're just as committed to transformative change as Sawant, but they're bringing a more rigorous, evidence-based approach to the work." The generational divide was becoming impossible to ignore. Sawant represented an older style of progressive politics, passionate, moral, but sometimes lacking in practical details. Roumie represented something newer, equally passionate and moral, but backed by extensive research and careful analysis. Young progressive activists began rallying around this new approach. "We can fight for justice and still do our homework" became a popular rallying cry on social media. The impact on Sawant personally was perhaps the most dramatic of all. Colleagues who had worked with her for decades described her as seeming genuinely shaken by the experience. For someone who had built her identity around being the most principled voice in progressive politics, being credibly accused of misleading the public was devastating. Several longtime Sawant allies privately encouraged her to consider whether it might be time to step back from her leadership role in the progressive movement. At 49, they argued perhaps it was time to pass the torch to a new generation. But Sawant, true to her stubborn nature, showed no signs of backing down. In a statement released a week after the hearing, she doubled down on her Medicare for All proposal, while acknowledging that some of the cost projections may need refinement. The statement satisfied no one. Sawant's critics saw it as an inadequate response to serious accusations of deception, while her supporters worry that she was showing weakness in the face of attacks from within her own movement. Meanwhile, Roumie continued to build momentum. His detailed policy proposals began gaining support from other progressive politicians who had previously been reluctant to challenge Sawant's approach. His office became a hub of activity as policy experts and progressive activists sought to align themselves with his more rigorous approach to reform. The transformation was remarkable. In the span of a single hearing, Roumie had gone from being seen as a promising but junior member of Congress to being recognized as a major force in progressive politics. But perhaps the most telling sign of how much had changed came 3 weeks after the hearing, when Sawant and Roumie found themselves at the same progressive conference in Chicago. Sawant, speaking first, delivered her standard passionate speech about economic inequality and healthcare reform, but the applause was noticeably more subdued than usual, and several times she seemed to lose her train of thought, something that had never happened in her decades of public speaking. When Roumie took the stage an hour later, the energy in the room was completely different. He delivered a detailed presentation on healthcare reform that included specific cost projections, implementation timelines, and realistic assessments of political challenges. The audience was captivated. Here was someone offering the transformative change they wanted, but with the practical details they needed to believe it was actually possible. The standing ovation lasted for several minutes, and when it was over, everyone in the room understood that they had witnessed more than just a good speech. They had witnessed the future of progressive politics. As the conference ended and politicians headed back to Washington, the new reality was impossible to ignore. The progressive movement had a new leader, and Roumie had earned his position not through years of gradual advancement, but through a single moment of brilliant preparation, meeting Sawant's overconfident dismissiveness. The era of Sawant's unquestioned progressive leadership was over. The era of Jonathan Roumie was just beginning, and it all started with a laugh that Kshama Sawant would spend the rest of her career regretting. If you found this incredible political showdown as fascinating as we did, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our latest political drama breakdowns. Let us know in the comments what you think about this generational shift in progressive politics. Are you Team Sawant or Team Roumie? And don't forget to share this video with anyone who needs to see what real political accountability looks like. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode where we'll be covering the fallout from this historic confrontation and what it means for the future of American politics.